Good afternoon. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Anita.
It's great to have you here, or actually it's great to have you back. We had the first conversation about AI about 6 months ago. Quite a lot has changed, quite a lot has happened in this space. And I actually wanted to start today by asking you, when we spoke 6 months ago, you made some predictions. How do they look now? Did they come true? Did they materialize?
We did. First of all, thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to be back. I enjoyed our conversation last time. So somehow I knew you'd ask me about them. So I've got them here, actually. I did make some predictions. I think you asked me about how I see the industry, the shape of the industry in the coming months and years. A lot had changed in the industry, especially the AI space, in the first part or the first half of 2023. So I gave 4 answers. So the first one was, I see more regulation on the horizon. I was actually more sure about that than some of the other ones, which is interesting. The second one was, I predicted more models geared towards what we call multimodal models and a focus on scalability. Number 3 was open source to become more robust and business ready and production ready. And number 4, I predict that we'll see some more data focused training extending from senior leadership to all the way to fresh grads. So I'm happy to say I'm 3 of 4, so not too bad. So the first one actually, didn't actualize, it didn't materialize. I did expect to see more regulation, and I expected that to impact some of the work that we do in this space. We all know about the high profile symposium or meeting that was hosted by Rishi Sunak just about a month and a half ago. Some of the leaders in the space of AI, including the likes of, OpenAI, senior figures, and, Elon Musk himself famously, had that interview with Rishi Sunak. That was designed to explore, I think, nothing really material, I guess, which has any major impact came out of that. So, to my knowledge. So I'm actually surprised that didn't happen. The 3 other predictions I made did actually come true, I'm happy to say. It's always nice when you predict something and it comes true in the financial services sector. The first was multimodal data and scalability. So essentially what that means is, if you remember back then when we chatted, when we had our conversation, you just prompt with purely it was text-based. There's been many examples where that prediction has now come true. Multimodal means the LLMs, the AIs that we interact with can accept, audio from the prompter or the prompt engineer or the user. Documents can be uploaded, or even video. So you can use the medium of video to communicate with the LLM. There are many examples I could give, but the one most recent in recent memory is just from a few days ago. Google launched Gemini, the latest AI. In fact, that's a perfect example to demonstrate that prediction, because I said 2 things. I said multimodal and I said scalability. So not only is Gemini multimodal, where the AI can accept all those different modes of data, it also is incredibly scalable. So they've released 3 versions of the model. The first one being the Ultra. That's still in production, in final stage of production. The Pro version, similar to what we see in kind of like the release of iPhones or the Samsung flagships. They've kind of followed that same model. The Pro is going to power the Bard chat system and other AIs. But then, interestingly, they've also got the Nano version. So the Nano version is designed to fit essentially on a modern smartphone, and so they've pretty much released those 3 levels to address the scalability problem, which is an open problem in AI research. So that one's come true, happy to say. The second one, or the third prediction I made, the second one that came true, is that open source will become more robust and business ready. So we'll get into a little bit of technical detail today, which I'm excited for in this webinar. And when it comes to open source, one example I could give where that's starting to become true and materialize, that prediction, is with AWS. So AWS have hosted a range of open source models now, more and more, including Llama 2 from Meta AI, including a whole bunch of other ones, and they are production ready. So they're ready for commercial use, and they're licensed for commercial use as well. So that's a part of the fair use policy within the terms of the agreement. And there's many more examples of that. So there is actually, I think that prediction has kind of materialized to some degree. The final one I made, which I guess is a little bit of a cheat because we work in the training sector as well. So I guess I had an advantage and a vantage point to make that prediction. And that final prediction, as I said before, was that training would increase in the data space, particularly for senior sponsorship all the way to new grads. And we have seen that at Fitch Learning.
Brilliant. So that clearly gives us a lot of hope that what we discussed today will also be true.
Possibly 3-in-1. So it's not
3-in-1. It's not a bad track record. Let's move on to the topic of today's webinar, and the topic is staying competitive with the latest AI applications. I'd like to start with the very basics, which is the data, right? So the modern AI tools are fueled by the various types of data, including unstructured data, and you've obviously touched on this already. So can you tell me a little bit about the types of data that can be used when working with AI models? And I think you've touched on it a little bit, but can you maybe expand?
Sure. So traditionally, I guess the holy grail when an analysis was always, we want numerical data, we work with numbers. Those data points are the most versatile when it comes to analysis. All your traditional statistical techniques, like, your correlation, pulling up a basic scatter graph. We all know that both axes or both columns or both fields need to be numeric fields for that scatter graph to be meaningful. Things like line plots or time series analysis, where we're looking at trends over time. Of course, on the x-axis, we expect some kind of time dimension, like days or months or hours. And on the y-axis, we expect a numerical field. We expect some kind of number that we're working with. All your traditional statistical tests, like your t-test or your ANOVAs, rely on somewhat numerical data. So the key thing here is the trend that we're, of course, witnessing, and I think one that we should all take it very seriously to learn and adopt, is that that's no longer the case. So traditionally, we've always known that a lot of knowledge and a wealth of insight is contained in human language. So we've always looked at books as sources of information, but we never really considered that to be something computers could use. As I said, it's always been, we need to get the data in numeric format in order for our computers to understand them and do some machine learning or do some predictive analytics. Now, with the advancement of key technologies in the space of large language models, textual data has now become absolutely available to all of our analytics that we're working on. And so in order to stay competitive, we need to make sure we appreciate that and no longer see that as some kind of unknown area that may be outside our comfort zone for analysts. The key advancement is that there are some really powerful technologies that convert that language into what we call embeddings or tokenization, meaning that there's some kind of underlying numerical representation of this language. And so subtle insights, linguistic traits, and the deconstruction of this language can actually happen very fast now using some of these modern techniques. And so we look at language to look at, for example, a client's or a customer's, our customers, what they're saying and what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And it might sound quite abstract to talk about what our clients or the sentiment or the market, what they're feeling or saying. But ultimately, the window to sentiment, what we call sentiment, is language. And so the text that we use to analyze this data is going to be rich for us to explore and mine. The challenge is, of course, where do we get this data from? We'll talk a little bit about some of these data sources. Some of the more unconventional types of unstructured data are, audio, images, video. The problem or the challenge for credit risk analysts and credit researchers is that some of that data is usually confined to within a company. And so, a company will have audio records and transcripts from their calls, for example. They would have collected that data in a fair use manner. They may have said at the beginning of the phone call, as we always hear, that the call is being monitored for improvement quality purposes, and that means that they can then explore and tap into that unstructured data using AI now to kind of analyze. But we haven't got access to that data typically because that's usually within the confines of a company. So when we're researching an entity, we usually rely on textual data. And that comes in many different ways. So we look at things like financial statements, and then the context will be provided by the appendices or the managerial discussions that will provide context for that. Things like corporate filings as well. Those first two examples will tell us a lot about the company's financial health, but then also social media and what people are saying. That will usually come by way of textual data. In addition to that, the company's website and blog posts, and all these things give us a really interesting picture But what we get out of it is down to the analyst. So the analyst really has their work cut out for them. So we're going from very messy, what we call messy data, to ideally, at the end of that life cycle, clear insights that can drive decisions. So, ideally, we want to arrive at some kind of perhaps a warning signal or some kind of predictive analytics or even some kind of dashboard that tells us some kind of health measure or whatever it is we're interested in. And that journey is really where the analyst has their work cut out for them. And so if you're interested in getting into the weeds about how we go from this very unstructured data source from the identification stage to the data acquisition stage, and that has a lot around it in terms of ethical data acquisition, to the pre-processing stage, the data engineering stage, and eventually the data mining stage, and then the analytical and predictive stage. And that's really where much of the technical work will happen. So those are the sources of the textual data. And it's only with modern analytical techniques that an analyst will be able to unlock that potential from those data sources.
Brilliant, that's really insightful. So before I move to the next question, let me just remind the audience that if you have any questions to Adam, please do submit them via the Q&A functionality so Adam can answer them at the very end. And the next question from me is, you've discussed the data, but if you want to make the most of the data, what tools can you actually use?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Now, the last thing you want as an analyst is for your tools to limit you, just like with any trade, of course, whether they're physical tools or metaphorical tools or digital tools. And so what we're seeing, which is very clear, is that learning a programming language is becoming more and more essential. In terms of which programming language to learn, if you're interested in data analytics and working with data, then the leaders are Python and R. And interestingly as well, so huge behemoths in kind of the IT services, IT solutions space, like Microsoft, for example. And I've been saying this since 2019, by the way. Another one of my predictions, I guess, is that it's only a matter of time before these companies start to adopt and realize that actually it's their presence or lack thereof in the open source global AI community which will dictate whether their dominance will continue in the space. So let me just explain that. So traditionally, a company like Microsoft, for example, providing more closed source proprietary solutions. Excel, of course, the bedrock of the financial services sector when it comes to data analytics. More modern tools like Power BI as well. And they have programming languages that they developed as well. So M, for example, is a programming language developed by Microsoft. And DAX as well, so DAX statements and things like that. And what's happening is they've actually made many strategic moves towards the open source community, because that's where the main action is taking place in AI and data analytics. And I usually actually just spitball this in the training room. Like, I've got a few points that I make and I want to communicate very clearly. And the reason why it's important is because we also are going through a transitionary period in the financial services sector where we're moving away from, or we're just adapting how we interact with some of these programs that I've mentioned, like the Microsoft Analytics Suite, for example, and appreciating that more and more it's becoming more and more important to learn tools like Python. And I just thought I'll go away and do a little bit of research about it. I've actually got here 6 points. I usually make about 3 points that I could think off the top of my head, but you expect a lot from your guests on the GICP webinar, so I made sure I did my homework. So here's a few points to think about. So here are 6 things that Microsoft have done over the last few years, and you'll see that the trend is actually quite apparent and quite clear. So the first thing, they've started to contribute to more open source projects. So things like Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. VS Code is an open source project, right? And it's one of 2 environments that I personally use and most people use for using Python for data analytics. So the first one being Jupyter Notebooks, which is absolutely fantastic for exploratory data analysis. We seldom approach a project where we know exactly what's required from the beginning, from the get-go. So a Jupyter Notebook is a perfect environment to explore and find out what it is I want to explore in the first place. And by the way, just pausing here very quickly, when you pursue some kind of initiative or idea in a exploratory data analysis environment, and that leads to a dead end, that is actually not a failure, because what you've just discovered is And it might sound like a spin, but it's actually just the reality, and it's true. What you've discovered is that actually there is no valid or there's no interesting insight to be found down that path. And that is of itself a useful, valuable insight. So exploratory data analysis, Jupyter Notebooks, however, more clean kind of scripts where you're ready to kind of deploy, and VS Code is a fantastic environment. So Microsoft have developed that as an open source project. They've acquired GitHub a few years ago now. So GitHub is the mothership, you could say, of the open source community. The open source community has one currency, and that currency is contribution. So that's anyone's value and worth, whether it's an individual coder or an analyst or programmer or developer or a researcher, their currency is measured in contribution. And so is the currency or the value of companies as well in this space. So ignoring the obvious Marxist undertones there, so, from when it comes to this system has worked very well with open source and data analytics and AI. And so the idea is based on knowledge sharing. And Microsoft have made an incredible move by acquiring a company like GitHub. As I said, it's the cradle of the open source community. That's where all the contributions take place. It might sound counterintuitive a little bit about this approach and why it's been so successful. Essentially, you can compare it to the success of, I'd say, the academic model or the university model. So in academia, a professor or a researcher will be thrilled to know that people have discovered their research or their papers or their work. Recognition and the sharing of knowledge is actually celebrated. Whereas in the kind of like the closed source corporate world, if you're putting a lot of money into R&D, like Microsoft, for example, developing a new programming language or making Excel that little bit faster or a little bit more versatile, you wouldn't want to share that with your competitors because it's seen as some kind of competitive advantage. And the reason why that works is the value is added through knowledge sharing because there's credit awarded. And so that value that one gets out of knowing that your work has been recognized and used, that is the currency. So contribution is there. So acquiring of GitHub, I think, is an incredible move by Microsoft. Number three, they have famously invested heavily and gone into partnership with OpenAI. And I know OpenAI isn't exactly the current day best standard for open source, but they have moved away from it slightly. There's a lot of speculation that the recent firing and then rehiring of Sam Altman may have had something to do with their open source culture versus their closed source strategy. I may be wrong there, but there's a lot of credible voices making that assumption. But their investment in a massive player in AI's mainstream community, like OpenAI, of course, undoubtedly was a huge move as well. Number four, the launch of Azure Notebooks. So in a corporate setting, running in some kind of Azure environment, the notebook technology that I spoke about earlier has been incorporated into the Azure cloud environment. And so that is another clear indication of their embracing of, or attempt to be associated with, the open source AI community. Number five, many people don't know this, they actually hired Guido van Rossum, who is the creator of Python. So he came out of retirement, was hired by Microsoft in 2020. And for me, that's just a clear indication that Python integration is only going to get bigger and better in the Microsoft Analytical Suite. 3 years later, Python turned up in Excel. So whether or not he was a part of that, we may know soon, but so far that hasn't been disclosed. I think it's probably common sense to assume that his hiring must have had something to do with a rollout of Python within Excel. You can now use Python inside Excel as recently as August. So just after we spoke last time, 2 months later, Python made its way to Excel. Python had already existed in Power BI for a while now as well. So working with something like Power BI, the benefits of working with something like Power BI is, I talked about that journey of an analyst. So you're going from something very unstructured, from just the inception of the idea of an analytical project, which is just how do we identify what it is we want to do and what the data sources are, as I said before, to the data acquisition stage, to the data cleaning stage, all the way to some kind of valid insight. Power BI sits right at the end of that. If it is going to be incorporated into some kind of analytical journey, right? It's right at the end of that. Now, Microsoft have invented proprietary tools like M for example, and DAX, to try and get Power BI to creep earlier downstream, right? To make it more valid of a tool, to maybe give it some worth and utility in upstream, like more of the data cleaning and data engineering phase. However, the reality is the momentum of the market and let's say analytical behavior or user consumer behavior is heavily swayed towards Python. So the path of least resistance for them isn't inventing a new programming language and asking everyone to adopt it. It's actually just doing the common sense thing, which is just allowing us to keep using Python. So they've incorporated Python and R, by the way. You can run Python R scripts in Power BI. So you can do your data cleaning, your pre-processing, all the other advanced stuff that comes with Python, the 400,000 libraries that you have available to you in Python in general. They may not all be accessible from Power BI's script running protocol, but most of them will be. And then you can incorporate that into, as I said, the end of that journey where you have a very powerful report, a very powerful dashboard with a very user-friendly environment integrated into Microsoft Fabric, which is now, of course, the broader family of their data analytics suite. So that will be the sixth thing that we can talk about. So Microsoft have clearly identified that. And I wanted to talk about that because, as I said, it's one of our, I don't want to say it's some kind of stumbling block, but Excel has long been as I said, the bedrock, and the Microsoft Analytics Suite have been the bedrock of our sector in terms of our analytics. And I want to encourage everyone to consider learning a language like Python and R so that your tools don't limit you in these scenarios. Now, just learning Python, of course, isn't enough. So Python's a general purpose programming language. And so the beauty of Python is that if you don't know exactly what you want to do or what you're going to have to do, but you know that learning a programming language is definitely something you want to equip yourself with, then learning Python will never be the wrong decision because you can always adapt it to pretty much any coding use case. Now, it's not the king of every single coding scenario, but it's definitely a very dominant and powerful and capable language in many different coding scenarios. It does, however, completely own data analytics and AI and machine learning. All right. So if you know you're going down that route, then Python's the language to learn. So as I said, it's not enough just to learn Python. We call it native Python. You want to make sure that you're learning specific applications and use cases. So I said we're going to get a little bit technical. I just want to make sure people take value and analysts take value out of this and they get some really clear directives. So you want to learn pandas, which is the Python library for data manipulation, data wrangling, and things like that. Then you want to specialize. If you're looking at unstructured data, you want to learn a library like Spacey. And there's another one called Flare NLP. Okay, so Spacey and Flare NLP. We've incorporated all these things into our training, of course, as you can imagine, a long time ago. As an active researcher in this space, I would highly recommend that either Spacey or Flare NLP become part of your fluent skills in data analytics. So what Spacey have done is, and Flare NLP, before the advent of these LLMs or these large language models, NLP used to look slightly different, as you can imagine, and there were very proficient libraries in that space. And they pivoted really well. So you have some companies, like translation companies, for example, language translation companies, who have pivoted really well, right? They've incorporated AI very quickly into their product and their services. Grammarly, everyone knows Grammarly. We see the adverts all the time pop up. Grammarly Go. What's Grammarly Go? It's their AI blended version, right? So in order to remain relevant. And so Spacey, an excellent Python library, have also pivoted. So they've actually incorporated large language models into their tools. Okay, so we don't have to feel like we're missing, any kind of modern technology. Another library to become really familiar with, although it will take many years to become familiar with it, is a library called Transformers. Transformers comes from a company called Hugging Face, named after the emoji, the hugging emoji. And it might sound like a bit of a silly, quirky name, but you'll get a lot of quirkiness in the branding of the AI space a lot. And it's actually a very serious player in the space. So pretty much all of the state-of-the-art language models can be imported and used in a coding environment using Python via the Transformer library. There's also some traditional libraries like NLTK. NLTK won't give you the state-of-the-art large language model, but it will give you the tools to do your data cleaning, your pre-processing. We do things like we remove stop words, so words like the and are. Also, there's a huge difference between written discourse. As an analyst, it's important to appreciate that distinction. So if your data is coming from a more formal document, it will require slightly different pre-processing than the unstructured transcript of a video, right? So maybe there's a talk delivered by a key player in an entity and it's very important and you want to incorporate this talk or this lecture or this webinar delivered by a company. So the transcript of that will contain a lot of ums and ahs and things like that. So it'll be a lot more unstructured, and we know in linguistics that written discourse is markedly different than spoken discourse, just from a functional grammatical perspective. And so a language library like NLTK, when learning Python, will help you in that appreciation of the understanding of. It also supports different languages as well. So I've worked extensively in both English and Arabic in data analytics and natural language processing, and it works very well with different languages, and so does Spacey and Flare NLP. In addition to that, the tools by itself isn't, of course, enough, and so a huge appreciation for something like the domain knowledge is essential, and other machine learning fundamentals and machine learning essential skills that need to come along with your skill set as well.
Brilliant. That's really, really insightful. When we look at, for instance, we have the data, right? We want to put it into the model, say large language model, and we want to look at the output. And how can we actually check the correctness of the output, right? So when we put in a query or we put in data and then we get something back, and how do we know this is actually correct? How can we assess this?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So there's a few ways we know that our analysis is meaningful or it's sensical. So there are some ground truth ways. So the constant attachment to the real world ground truth with human experts. So subject matter experts, they are the ground truth, and that hasn't changed. One thing to note is these LLMs that we see and we are incredibly impressed by, all the data that exists on the internet has been utilized already. Okay, we have arguably, okay, this is debatable, but I am someone who takes the opinion that we have a poverty of data problem in the critical path to improving research in AI, or you could say a scarcity problem. These massive companies, OpenAI, Google, etc., Meta AI, they have access to pretty much all the data on the internet, and they've already used it to train. So the improvements are coming from different ways, right? What data to include in the training of the model and what not to include, what blend of data, what smart, novel data engineering techniques to improve the training, and all these other things that go into improving LLM models. So ultimately, the ground truth is still going to come from human experts, okay? So that's one way, and that way is indispensable, and it's irreplaceable. And we achieve that by setting up data life cycles where there's what we call a human in the loop system. Okay, so there's actually people there checking and verifying the results, so they're sensible. And a technical answer I can give you is there are many ways to validate models, tried and tested ways in the machine learning approach to analytics. We call it cross-validation. There are metrics like accuracy, the F1 score, recall, and precision. It's important to become familiar with all of them. And I could tell you that the state of the art, what we call the SOTA, S-O-T-A, or the state of the art in natural language processing and using textual unstructured data is very high. So things like natural language inference, I believe the state of the art is around 93% accuracy. Named entity recognition, which is very important for credit analysts. So we go through all this structured data. We want to know when a named entity is mentioned, right? Rather than the fruit apple, and adding that to your model, which will be a huge blunder. When is the company Apple actually mentioned? So an AI will need to distinguish between the fruit apple in a bunch of text, right? and the company. That's called named entity recognition. And so the state of the art there is around 95%, and that's going to be the F1 score. Q&A, so question and answering, is another task you do. So you fine tune an LLM on your data, and then you get to ask your LLM questions, just straight up, unstructured, as if you're talking to a human, ask and querying about your data set. The F1 score, state of the art, current benchmark is around 95%. There are other tasks like opinion mining you can do. So you can actually mine opinions, right? Not just statements, not just propositions, not just news or headlines or updates, actual opinions, right? So an expression of a position that someone is taking for a company or for an entity. The state of the art there is around 96%. That's going to be a mixture of F1 score and accuracy score. Other tasks like text classification, the accuracy score is 98%. So very, very high. And finally, things like sentiment analysis, which I mentioned earlier. The state of the art there is also around 98 to 99%. That was achieved by a model called T5 or FLAN T5. That model is accessible to any analyst using the tools that I've already mentioned. So learning Python, using a library like Transformers. You can access the T5 model. It's open source as well. So it's part of the open source projects, meaning that you can fine tune it, meaning that you have not always, but in this case, you have a commercial license. And you can just use these pretty much straight out of the box as long as you've got robust data processing skills, and you have, of course, domain knowledge and a good groundwork in machine learning understanding. And as I said, the state of the art there is very high.
These are really, really high and impressive numbers. Now, moving on a little bit, and focusing on analytical techniques, any particular one that's your favorite?
Well, from an intellectual curiosity perspective, there are, but I don't think that's interesting. I think what's interesting is applications, really. So I do have my favorites just from intellectual curiosity, but what my real favorites are any technique that meets a real business use case, and there's a lot of stuff going on at Fitch, as you can imagine. And really the projects that matter time and time again are the projects that have an actual business case. There's nothing more satisfying than not just analyzing and researching for the sake of it, because something is intellectually interesting, but actually solving and addressing a real world business problem. And there's no point forecasting something if your forecasting of this number or some kind of figure has no real action that you can take in the real business world. It's just not of value. So well done achieving 99% in your forecast according to your validation against the data. Are we going to use it? Do we need it? Is the question. And as I said, there's nothing more satisfying than actually solving a real world business problem. So any technique of the aforementioned techniques that solve a real business world problem is my favorite technique.
All right, brilliant. So listen, Adam, last question from me before we move to the questions from the audience. So again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please do submit them via the Q&A functionality and we will answer them. The last question from me, Adam, from an organizational perspective, what's your advice for staying competitive with the latest AI applications?
So from an organizational perspective, maybe a few practical tips I'll give. So first things first is don't miss the low-hanging fruit. Right, I know the holy grail of AI that you can, really show off about, and it will give you great credibility if you can take a pre-trained base model and fine-tune it on your own company's data. Let's say the company's called, I don't know, Oranges, so it'll be Oranges GPT, right? You create your own GPT. I know that's tempting. That's kind of like reaching for the stars. If you have the technical capabilities and the business understanding of application and everything else needed and the strategy and the infrastructure to actually achieve that, then that's brilliant. But what we can do is we can kind of miss the forest for the leaves sometimes. And so the low-hanging fruit can make instant improvements to your workflow. And some of those things are the things I mentioned today. So anything that can be replaced, any administrative laborious task, which is eating up your resources as a team, that can be replaced today. There's no shame in making these incremental small improvements to your workflow with some of the low-hanging fruit in AI and some of the off-the-shelf solutions. The next thing I'll say is don't make the mistake of missing out or leaving out non-technical people in your organization. They should, and they can and they should contribute to the forum, to the discussion of your AI strategy. And just because what happens is you just miss out on this wealth without democratizing the process and having that inclusive discussion with pretty much everyone across the business who uses a computer is the only real criteria for me anyway. Then you miss out on a wealth of insight and real world hands-on experience of what this process looks like and how it can be improved using AI. Another way to stay competitive is to not rely purely on hiring talent. I think the proposed solution that hiring talent who have a particular skill set to meet a business need is becoming at times a quick fix. The truth is the space is moving so fast that there is no escaping continual training and continual learning, right? Because you're just continually having to catch up with it. So yes, we can maybe cut some kind of corner by saying, well, let's hire talent to meet this skill, but then that skill will then develop really before your very eyes. That's how fast this space is moving. So no quick fix to how fast this industry is moving and how fast this space is developing, other than continual training. Another piece of advice I'll give is not to FOMO in to AI. Yes, there is a lot of pressure, I think. Sometimes it comes right from the top in an organization, right? There's sometimes clear directives. We need to see AI and we need to see it quick, which is important. Sometimes, in fact, all the time, that push is essential, right? So without the senior sponsorship, sometimes, it's hard to actually realize whether there's a mandate or not. So having that support from senior sponsorship is important, but don't let that lead to you just the fear of missing out on this AI train and just trying to grab any old AI application. That can sometimes be less efficient than actually doing things without AI. So make sure your decision to incorporate AI is well thought through, and as per my previous answers, includes a real world, boots on the ground understanding of what the applications are and what the AI should entail.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have a couple more minutes for questions. Is GitHub expected to continue being open source with Microsoft? Are any changes in GitHub expected after the acquisition?
So it would be a disastrous move for Microsoft to disrupt the fluidity and the stability and this organic ecosystem of the open source community. So I do not foresee Microsoft disrupting that at all. In fact, I think it will be completely counterintuitive or against why they invested in such a move in the first place. The reason why is they want to be seen as part of the open source community, and they want to be included in the discussion of open source AI to hopefully, in their eyes, continue their dominance and relevance in data analytics and the AI space. So how GitHub works is, people host projects on there and people collaborate on there.
Brilliant. And the next question we have from the audience is, what are the emerging trends in AI that businesses should be aware of right now?
Emerging trends in AI, I think we've mentioned them today. I don't want to steer too far away from the topic and just give a general update of industry. I think some of what I've mentioned today covers the large portion of what we should be interested in as analysts in this space. So looking at unstructured data and how to incorporate that into our analytical models is, I guess, the most significant trend.
Brilliant, thank you. And the next question is, how does AI integration impact the workforce and how can we prepare employees for those changes?
Well, data literacy is one huge way you can prepare employees. Taking on board my advice that, most people in an organization should definitely be considered as part of the discussion for how AI will be integrated. Taking representatives from different functions is a great way of democratizing that process. And ensuring that data literacy is just as important as any other standard training offered by an organization, like, for example, regulatory training, like training about the culture of an organization and essential skills. Data literacy should be seen as one of those things.
Brilliant. So a couple more questions. So an interesting one. So what metrics should companies look at to measure the success of their AI initiatives?
Well, I've got a answer for this I always give, so I'm just going to go back to that answer. I might have mentioned it in our first webinar. So there's 4 areas I would always advise. Number 1, strategy and sponsorship. So defining a CDO, so an actual chief data office, or something similar that does a similar thing. That's number one. Number two is the data infrastructure. Okay, so actually having, and believe me, this is one of the biggest complaints we get in the training room, which is, we loved the content, we love the training, I want to use this skill. Our problem is we just can't get the data. And so what we've started to do is actually work with our clients, and actually help them actualize their AI maturity through these webinars, through other training sessions that we're offering, through an interaction with our different teams and functions here at Fitch. Because without actually achieving a somewhat sophisticated AI infrastructure or data infrastructure in the first place, it's very hard to kind of deploy anything of high impact. That's number two. Number three is talent. That's another way you can measure it. What their strategy is in L&D for keeping up with these trends. And number four escapes me. So I've mentioned it many times and I've forgotten it. So there is a fourth one, and I forgot what it is. Maybe we can put it in the show notes, or if you have something like that.
Brilliant, Adam. Listen, that's been super insightful, very exhaustive. So we're actually coming to the end of the session. We have covered all the questions from the audience. So thank you so much to the audience for joining today. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
We will invite you again in about half a year's time, see how which of those predictions have turned out true. Thank you so much for the session.
Thank
Really
you,
appreciate it.
Really enjoyed it.